Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellowed pages of the Kentucky Historical Society's archives contain many forgotten testimonies, but few as disturbing as the collection of documents labeled Cartwright Estate, 1847. Filed beneath decades of dust in the basement of the Frankfurt repository, these papers emerged during a routine cataloging project in 1923, nearly 8 decades after the events they describe. The collection consists of 17 items: medical examinations, correspondence from local clergy, testimonies from neighbors, and most significantly, excerpts from what appears to be a family Bible bearing unusual annotations in multiple hands. Dr. Nathaniel Morse, the physician who first documented the case, wrote in his initial report that he had encountered manifestations of religious mania unlike any recorded in contemporary medical literature. His careful script, preserved in brown ink that has faded to the color of dried blood, describes his first visit to the Cartwright homestead in the autumn of 1847. The property, located 17 miles southeast of Bowling Green, sat isolated among rolling hills that local residents had begun to avoid even before the tragedy unfolded. Isaac Cartwright had inherited both the land and the peculiar Bible from his grandfather, Jeremiah, who had died under circumstances that the family preferred not to discuss. The inheritance came with specific instructions, written in Jeremiah's trembling hand on a separate document that accompanied the will. These instructions, according to Dr. Morse's notes, pertain to the proper interpretation of divine commandments as revealed through careful study of the annotated text. The Bible itself, bound in black leather that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, bore the marks of multiple generations of study. The Cartwright family had lived quietly in Warren County for 3 generations before Isaac's troubles began. His father, Tobias, had been a respected member of the local Presbyterian congregation, known for his charitable works and steady temperament. Isaac had inherited these qualities, according to testimonies from neighbors who knew him before the summer of 1847. He was described as a devoted husband to his wife, Margaret, and a gentle father to their 3 children: Ruth, age 9, Benjamin, age 7, and little Mary, barely 4 years old. The first signs of Isaac's transformation appeared in late June, following a period of intense study with the inherited Bible. Margaret Cartwright's sister, Elizabeth Thornton, later testified that Isaac had begun spending entire nights in his study, emerging at dawn with ink-stained fingers and an expression she described as both terrified and exhilarated. The Bible, she noted, seemed to require constant attention, as though its meaning shifted with each reading. Dr. Morse's examination of the text revealed annotations in at least 4 different hands, spanning what appeared to be several decades. The earliest notes, written in faded brown ink, consisted of simple cross-references and biblical citations. However, the more recent editions, which Dr. Morse attributed to Isaac based on handwriting analysis, showed a progressive deterioration in both penmanship and content. These later annotations focused obsessively on passages relating to divine commands and the testing of faith through sacrifice. The physician's report describes the Bible's physical condition as unnaturally preserved, noting that despite its apparent age, the leather binding showed no signs of cracking, and the pages remained supple and white. More disturbing were the marginal notes that seemed to respond to one another across generations, creating what Dr. Morse termed a dialogue between the living and the dead. The annotation suggested that each generation of Cartwright men had struggled with similar compulsions, though none had acted upon them with Isaac's ultimate determination. Margaret Cartwright's testimony, recorded 3 days after the incident, provides the most detailed account of her husband's final weeks. She described how Isaac had begun to speak of divine mathematics and the numerical significance of biblical commands. He had developed an obsession with water, spending hours by the creek that ran behind their property, measuring its depth and current with makeshift tools. His behavior toward the children had grown increasingly strange, though not yet threatening. He would study their faces with an intensity that frightened Margaret, as though searching for signs or portents that only he could interpret. The local minister, Reverend Caleb Morrison, had attempted to counsel Isaac in early August, but his visit had ended abruptly when Isaac presented him with the annotated Bible. Reverend Morrison's written account, included in the archive, describes his profound unease upon examining the text. He noted that the annotations seemed to twist the sacred words into commands that no righteous God would issue, and he urged Isaac to destroy the book immediately. Isaac's response to this suggestion marked the beginning of his final descent into what Dr. Morse would later classify as hereditary religious psychosis with homicidal manifestations. Dr. Nathaniel Morse's subsequent visits to the Cartwright homestead revealed a household in gradual decline, though the deterioration manifested in subtle ways that made precise documentation challenging. His medical journal, written in the methodical style characteristic of 19th-century physicians, records observations that grew increasingly disturbing with each entry. The doctor noted that Isaac's physical appearance had begun to change in ways that suggested prolonged sleep deprivation and poor nutrition, despite Margaret's continued efforts to maintain normal household routines. The annotated Bible had assumed a central position in the Cartwright home, resting on a specially constructed lectern in Isaac's study. Dr. Morse observed that the book appeared to be consulted multiple times throughout each day, with Isaac approaching it in a ritualistic manner that involved specific preparations. These included the washing of hands in creek water that Isaac collected each morning, the arrangement of candles in patterns that corresponded to biblical numerology, and the recitation of passages in what Margaret described as a voice not entirely his own. The physician's examination of Isaac revealed physical symptoms consistent with extreme psychological distress. His pulse remained elevated even during periods of apparent calm, and his pupils showed unusual dilation when discussing religious matters. Most concerning were the marks on Isaac's hands and forearms, which appeared to be self-inflicted wounds arranged in patterns that mirrored certain marginal annotations in the Bible. When questioned about these injuries, Isaac claimed they appeared spontaneously during his periods of study, manifesting as signs of divine approval for his growing understanding of the text's true meaning. Margaret Cartwright's condition had also begun to deteriorate, though her decline took the form of nervous exhaustion rather than religious mania. Dr. Morse noted that she had developed a persistent tremor in her hands and had begun to experience what she described as waking nightmares, in which she heard voices calling to her from the creek behind their property. These episodes occurred most frequently during the hours when Isaac was engaged in his biblical studies, suggesting a possible connection between his activities and her psychological distress. The children's behavior provided additional cause for concern. Ruth, the eldest, had become withdrawn and fearful, spending most of her time in the kitchen with her mother rather than playing outdoors, as had been her custom. Benjamin exhibited signs of acute anxiety, particularly when his father attempted to include him in evening prayers. The boy had developed a stutter that became more pronounced whenever Isaac read aloud from the annotated Bible. Little Mary, perhaps due to her young age, seemed less affected by the household's changing atmosphere, though she had begun to speak of the man in the water who visited her dreams. Dr. Morse's analysis of the Bible itself required several sessions, as Isaac proved reluctant to allow extended examination of the text. The physician's notes describe annotations that seemed to multiply between visits, as though new insights were being added to the margins with increasing frequency. The handwriting in these recent editions showed signs of deterioration, with letters becoming increasingly erratic and difficult to decipher. More troubling were the mathematical calculations that had begun to appear alongside biblical passages, complex formulas that seemed designed to determine optimal timing for unspecified actions. The creek that ran behind the Cartwright property had become a focal point of Isaac's attention, and Dr. Morse devoted considerable effort to understanding this obsession. His measurements of the waterway revealed nothing unusual about its depth or current, yet Isaac had begun to speak of it as though it possessed supernatural properties. The physician observed Isaac spending hours by the water's edge, sometimes remaining motionless for such extended periods that he appeared to be in a trance-like state. Local residents had begun to notice changes in the Cartwright family's behavior, though their observations were filtered through the lens of rural superstition and religious conservatism. Several neighbors reported seeing lights in Isaac's study at all hours of the night, accompanied by what they described as unnatural sounds that seemed to emanate from within the house. Others claimed that the creek's water had taken on an unusual color during the weeks following Isaac's increased attention to the waterway, though Dr. Morse's examination revealed no evidence of contamination. The physician's correspondence with colleagues in Louisville and Lexington sought guidance on similar cases of religious mania, but the responses he received offered little practical assistance. The medical understanding of psychological disorders remained primitive in 1847, and Isaac's particular combination of symptoms defied easy categorization. Dr. Morse found himself relying increasingly on his own observations and instincts, documenting behaviors that seemed to follow patterns established by previous generations of Cartwright men. The annotated Bible's influence appeared to be spreading beyond Isaac himself, affecting the entire household in ways that Dr. Morse struggled to explain through conventional medical theory. His notes from late August describe an atmosphere of mounting tension that seemed to permeate every aspect of daily life at the Cartwright homestead. The Kentucky Historical Society's archives contain additional documents that shed light on the Cartwright family's troubled history, materials that Dr. Morse discovered during his investigation into Isaac's condition. These records, dating back to the late 18th century, reveal a disturbing pattern of behavior among Cartwright men that seemed to manifest in roughly 30-year cycles. The pattern's consistency across 3 generations suggested something more systematic than mere coincidence, though the exact nature of the phenomenon remained elusive. Jeremiah Cartwright, Isaac's grandfather, had exhibited similar symptoms during the autumn of 1816, according to testimony from his surviving contemporaries. The elderly residents of Warren County who remembered Jeremiah described a man who had undergone a dramatic transformation following his inheritance of the family Bible from his own father, Ezekiel. Jeremiah's case had been documented by a traveling minister named Reverend Josiah Fletcher, whose journal entries describe behaviors remarkably similar to those Dr. Morse observed in Isaac. Reverend Fletcher's account details Jeremiah's obsession with biblical numerology and his conviction that certain passages contained hidden instructions that revealed themselves only through careful study and mathematical analysis. Like Isaac, Jeremiah had developed an intense fascination with water, specifically with the creek that ran through the family property. The minister noted that Jeremiah had begun to speak of the waterway as though it possessed consciousness and purpose, referring to it as the instrument of divine will, in conversations that grew increasingly incoherent as autumn progressed. The similarities between grandfather and grandson extended to physical symptoms as well. Reverend Fletcher described the same self-inflicted markings on Jeremiah's arms, the same pattern of sleep deprivation, and the same ritualistic approach to studying the annotated Bible. Most disturbing was Fletcher's observation that Jeremiah had begun to view his own children through the lens of biblical sacrifice, though the minister's intervention had prevented any tragic outcome. Jeremiah's wife, Rebecca, had taken their children and fled to her sister's home in Nashville after discovering her husband's intentions. Jeremiah's story ended differently than Isaac's would, but not without tragedy. On November 15, 1816, neighbors found him floating face down in the creek behind his property, his body bearing the same mysterious markings that had appeared on his arms during his period of religious mania. The local coroner ruled the death accidental, though Reverend Fletcher's private notes suggest the minister harbored suspicions about the true nature of Jeremiah's demise. The Bible had been found open beside the creek, its pages undamaged despite exposure to the elements. Ezekiel Cartwright's story, pieced together from fragmentary records and oral histories, followed a similar trajectory during the 1780s. The earliest documentation comes from a letter written by a circuit judge who had been called to investigate reports of ungodly practices at the Cartwright homestead. The judge's correspondence describes a man consumed by religious fervor who claimed to receive direct communications from divine sources through careful interpretation of biblical text. Ezekiel's case had attracted the attention of local authorities due to his public proclamations about the necessity of absolute obedience to divine commands, regardless of their apparent cruelty. The annotated Bible itself appeared to be the common thread connecting these generational episodes. Dr. Morse's examination revealed that each generation had added their own interpretations to the margins, creating a layered text that seemed to grow more complex and disturbing with each addition. The earliest annotations, attributed to Ezekiel, focused on passages relating to divine testing and the demonstration of faith through sacrifice. Jeremiah's contributions had expanded these themes, adding mathematical formulas and astronomical calculations that appeared to be attempts at determining divinely ordained timing for specific actions. Isaac's recent additions to the text showed the most sophisticated understanding of the accumulated annotations, as though each generation had built upon the insights of their predecessors. His handwriting revealed a man struggling to reconcile conflicting interpretations while adding his own, increasingly desperate attempts to decode what he believed to be divine instructions. The margins of certain pages had become so crowded with annotations that the original biblical text was barely visible beneath layers of commentary spanning 3 generations. Dr. Morse's investigation into the Bible's origins proved frustrating, as records from the late 18th century were incomplete and often contradictory. What emerged was a picture of a text that had been in the Cartwright family since their arrival in Kentucky, possibly acquired during their migration from Virginia in the 1770s. Local historians suggested that the Bible might have belonged to a religious sect that had practiced unusual interpretations of Scripture, though no definitive evidence supported this theory. The physician's growing understanding of the generational pattern filled him with increasing dread as he observed Isaac's condition deteriorating throughout the late summer of 1847. The historical precedent suggested that Isaac's obsession would reach a crisis point as autumn approached, following the same timeline that had governed his father's and grandfather's descents into madness. The first week of September 1847 marked a decisive shift in Isaac Cartwright's condition, as documented in Dr. Morse's increasingly urgent medical reports. The physician noted that Isaac's behavior had begun to follow patterns that seemed predetermined, as though he were following instructions visible only to himself. The annotated Bible now required constant attention, with Isaac consulting the text at precise intervals throughout each day, his movements becoming ritualistic to the point of compulsion. Margaret Cartwright's testimony from this period reveals a household transformed by mounting tension and inexplicable phenomena. She described how Isaac had begun to rearrange furniture in their home according to what he called sacred geometry, creating pathways that led from room to room in patterns that corresponded to diagrams he had drawn in the Bible's margins. These modifications served no apparent practical purpose, yet Isaac insisted they were essential for maintaining what he termed divine alignment within their domestic space. The children's responses to their father's transformation varied according to their ages and temperaments. Ruth had developed an acute sensitivity to Isaac's presence, often fleeing to her room when he entered common areas of the house. Her sleep had become fitful, interrupted by nightmares that she described to her mother in fragmentary whispers. Benjamin's stutter had worsened to the point where he could barely communicate, particularly during the evening hours when Isaac conducted his biblical studies. Little Mary continued to speak of her dreams about the man in the water, though her descriptions had grown more detailed and disturbing. Dr. Morse's examination of Isaac during the second week of September revealed physical changes that defied medical explanation. The self-inflicted markings on Isaac's arms had begun to form recognizable patterns that corresponded to symbols found in the Bible's margins. More troubling was the physician's observation that these wounds seemed to heal and reappear in cyclical patterns, as though Isaac's body were responding to some internal calendar that governed the manifestation of the markings. The creek behind the Cartwright property had become the focal point of Isaac's daily routine. Dr. Morse observed that Isaac spent increasingly long periods by the water's edge, sometimes remaining motionless for hours while staring into the slow-moving current. The physician's attempts to understand this behavior led him to conduct his own examination of the waterway, searching for any unusual properties that might explain Isaac's fascination. His measurements revealed nothing extraordinary about the creek's depth, temperature, or mineral content, yet Isaac continued to treat it as though it possessed supernatural significance. Local residents had begun to avoid the area around the Cartwright homestead, though their reasons varied according to individual temperament and religious conviction. Some claimed to have heard unusual sounds emanating from the property during the night hours, descriptions that ranged from musical tones to what one neighbor characterized as the sound of many voices speaking in unison. Others reported seeing lights moving through the trees around the creek, though these sightings occurred only during Isaac's periods of intensive biblical study. The annotated Bible itself had begun to exhibit properties that Dr. Morse found difficult to document in his medical reports. The physician noted that certain pages seemed to remain open without external support, as though the book were displaying specific passages for Isaac's attention. More disturbing was Dr. Morse's observation that the ink used in recent annotations appeared to change color depending on lighting conditions, shifting from black to deep red when viewed by candlelight. Isaac's relationship with his family had deteriorated to the point where Margaret had begun to consider seeking refuge with relatives in neighboring counties. However, her attempts to discuss departure plans with Isaac met with responses that suggested he viewed any separation from the family as a violation of divine will. The physician noted that Isaac had begun to speak of his wife and children in terms that suggested he no longer saw them as individuals, but rather as elements in a larger pattern that required careful management according to biblical precedent. The mathematical calculations that Isaac had been adding to the Bible's margins had grown increasingly complex, filling entire pages with formulas that seemed designed to determine optimal timing for unspecified actions. Dr. Morse's consultation with mathematics professors at Transylvania University in Lexington yielded no insight into the purpose or meaning of these calculations, though the academics confirmed that the mathematical work demonstrated sophisticated understanding of numerical relationships. September's progression brought subtle changes to the natural environment around the Cartwright property that multiple witnesses documented independently. The creek's water level had begun to fluctuate without apparent correlation to rainfall or seasonal patterns. Trees near the waterway showed signs of stress despite the mild autumn weather, with leaves yellowing and falling weeks ahead of their normal schedule. Even the local wildlife seemed affected, with birds avoiding the area and domestic animals displaying unusual agitation when brought near the property. Dr. Morse's growing alarm at these developments led him to increase the frequency of his visits, though Isaac had begun to view the physician's presence with suspicion and hostility. The third week of September brought developments that Dr. Morse would later describe as the point of no return in Isaac Cartwright's descent into what the physician termed divinely inspired madness. Isaac's behavior had crystallized into a rigid schedule of activities that seemed to follow instructions contained within the annotated Bible, though the specific nature of these commands remained opaque to outside observers. The physician noted that Isaac had begun to treat each day as though it were part of a countdown toward some predetermined event. Margaret Cartwright's final testimony, recorded after the tragedy, provides the most detailed account of her husband's preparations during this critical period. She described how Isaac had begun to modify their home in ways that served no apparent domestic purpose, but seemed designed to facilitate some form of ritual observance. Furniture had been removed from certain rooms, creating empty spaces that Isaac filled with arrangements of candles, stones collected from the creek bed, and pages torn from almanacs and agricultural journals. The annotated Bible had assumed an even more central role in Isaac's daily routine, with specific passages being read at predetermined times, according to a schedule that Isaac had calculated using his increasingly complex mathematical formulas. Dr. Morse observed that Isaac's approach to the text had become entirely mechanical, as though he were following a set of instructions rather than seeking spiritual guidance. The physician noted that Isaac no longer seemed to be interpreting the annotations, but rather implementing them as though they were technical specifications. Isaac's physical condition had deteriorated markedly during this period, though his decline manifested in ways that suggested purposeful self-deprivation rather than illness. He had begun to fast for extended periods, consuming only water drawn from the creek behind their property. His sleep patterns had become erratic to the point where Margaret was uncertain whether he slept at all, though she occasionally found him in his study in states that resembled unconsciousness more than natural rest. The children's responses to their father's transformation had reached a crisis point that forced Margaret to make increasingly desperate attempts to protect them from Isaac's attention. Ruth had developed a persistent fever that Dr. Morse attributed to nervous exhaustion, while Benjamin had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through gestures and written notes. Little Mary's dreams about the man in the water had become so vivid that she often confused them with waking experiences, leading to episodes of confusion that left her unable to distinguish between reality and nightmare. Dr. Morse's examination of the creek during this period revealed changes that defied rational explanation. The water's temperature had dropped significantly below normal seasonal levels, creating conditions that seemed inconsistent with the mild September weather. More disturbing was the physician's observation that the creek's current had begun to flow in patterns that appeared almost deliberate, creating eddies and backflows that formed temporary pools in areas where the streambed had previously been uniform. Local wildlife had abandoned the area entirely by late September, leaving an unnatural silence that multiple witnesses documented in their testimonies. Birds that had nested in trees along the creek for generations had departed without apparent cause, while domestic animals refused to approach the Cartwright property even when led by their owners. The absence of normal environmental sounds created an atmosphere that neighbors described as oppressive and threatening. Isaac's interactions with his family had become increasingly ritualistic, with his attention to the children taking on qualities that Margaret found deeply disturbing. He had begun to study their faces with an intensity that suggested he was searching for specific signs or characteristics, occasionally making notes in the Bible's margins that seemed to correspond to his observations. His treatment of the children had become formal and distant, as though he were preparing them for some form of ceremony rather than maintaining normal parental relationships. The annotated Bible's physical properties had continued to evolve in ways that Dr. Morse struggled to document objectively. Certain pages seemed to emit a faint luminescence during evening hours, while others appeared to absorb light rather than reflecting it. The physician noted that the book's weight seemed to fluctuate without explanation, sometimes requiring considerable effort to lift and at other times feeling almost weightless in Isaac's hands. Isaac's mathematical calculations had reached a level of complexity that filled every available margin in the Bible, creating a secondary text that seemed to overlay and interpret the original biblical passages. These formulas appeared to be designed to determine precise timing for actions that Isaac referred to in his notes as the fulfillment of generational obligations. October 1st, 1847, marked the beginning of what Dr. Morse would later classify as the final phase of Isaac Cartwright's psychological deterioration. The physician's notes from this date describe a man who had transcended ordinary madness and entered a state that seemed to exist beyond conventional understanding of mental illness. Isaac's behavior had acquired a precision and purposefulness that suggested he was operating according to instructions that had become absolutely clear to him, though their source remained incomprehensible to observers. Margaret Cartwright's account of the events leading up to the tragedy begins with her husband's activities during the early hours of October 1st. She described waking before dawn to find Isaac absent from their bed, a discovery that had become routine during the preceding weeks. However, this particular morning brought the realization that Isaac had not merely risen early, but had apparently not slept at all. His study showed signs of intensive activity throughout the night, with candles burned down to stubs and new annotations covering previously blank pages of the Bible. The annotated Bible had undergone its most dramatic transformation during this nocturnal session. Dr. Morse's examination revealed that Isaac had added what appeared to be a complete reinterpretation of key biblical passages, written in handwriting that showed none of the deterioration characteristic of his recent work. These new annotations demonstrated a clarity and coherence that contrasted sharply with the increasingly erratic quality of his previous additions to the text. The physician noted that the new material seemed to provide definitive answers to questions that had been developing across multiple generations of Cartwright annotations. Isaac's physical appearance on October 1st reflected the profound changes in his mental state. Margaret observed that her husband's face had acquired an expression of absolute certainty that she found more terrifying than his previous manifestations of confusion and anxiety. His movements had become deliberate and economical, as though he were conserving energy for tasks that required precise execution. Most disturbing was the complete absence of the nervous agitation that had characterized his behavior throughout September. The children's responses to their father's transformation on this date provided additional evidence of the fundamental shift in Isaac's condition. Ruth, who had spent weeks avoiding her father's presence, found herself unable to look away from him when he entered rooms where she was present. Benjamin's selective mutism deepened to the point where he seemed incapable of producing any vocal sounds, though his eyes tracked Isaac's movements with an intensity that suggested profound fear. Little Mary's dreams about the man in the water had apparently ceased, replaced by a waking fixation on the creek that mirrored her father's obsession. Dr. Morse's visit to the Cartwright homestead on October 1st revealed environmental changes that seemed to accelerate during the hours of his observation. The creek behind the property had developed characteristics that defied natural explanation, with the water taking on a clarity that made the streambed visible to depths that should have been impossible given the creek's normal turbidity. The physician noted that the water's surface remained perfectly still despite the presence of current, creating an effect that resembled polished glass more than flowing water. The silence that had characterized the area around the Cartwright property throughout late September had deepened to an extent that Dr. Morse found physically uncomfortable. The absence of normal environmental sounds created an atmosphere that seemed to amplify the smallest noises, making footsteps and breathing unnaturally prominent. This acoustic phenomenon extended beyond the immediate vicinity of the house, affecting an area that encompassed several acres around the creek. Isaac's preparations during October 1st followed patterns that seemed to have been predetermined by his study of the annotated Bible. Margaret observed him gathering specific items from throughout their home, including rope, stones from the creek bed, and clothing that belonged to each of the children. These materials were arranged in the study according to a configuration that corresponded to diagrams Isaac had drawn in the Bible's margins during his nocturnal session. The mathematical calculations that had consumed Isaac's attention throughout September had apparently reached their conclusion during the night of September 30th. Dr. Morse's examination of the final formulas revealed computations that seemed designed to determine optimal conditions for actions that Isaac referred to in his notes as the completion of the covenant. These calculations incorporated astronomical data, tidal information despite the family's inland location, and numerical relationships derived from biblical passages. Isaac's behavior toward his family on October 1st demonstrated a detachment that Margaret found more disturbing than his previous manifestations of religious mania. He observed his wife and children with the clinical interest of a natural philosopher studying specimens, occasionally making notes that seemed to record their responses to his presence. His attention to the children had acquired qualities that suggested he was conducting some form of final assessment. The events of October 2nd, 1847, unfolded with a precision that suggested Isaac Cartwright had been following a predetermined schedule calculated to the minute. Dr. Morse's reconstruction of the timeline, based on Margaret's testimony and physical evidence discovered at the scene, reveals a sequence of actions that demonstrated both meticulous planning and complete detachment from normal human emotion. The physician noted that Isaac's behavior during the final hours showed no signs of hesitation or internal conflict, as though he had transcended ordinary moral considerations entirely. Margaret Cartwright's account begins with her awakening at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning to find Isaac standing beside their bed, fully dressed and carrying the annotated Bible. His appearance suggested that he had been awake for hours, though his demeanor showed none of the exhaustion that had characterized his recent sleepless nights. Instead, Margaret observed a quality of focused energy that reminded her of how Isaac had appeared on their wedding day, though the similarity filled her with inexplicable dread rather than comfort. Isaac's actions during the pre-dawn hours followed a sequence that appeared to have been rehearsed through careful study of the Bible's annotations. He moved through their home with purposeful efficiency, gathering items that he had apparently identified as necessary for the completion of his task. These materials included lengths of rope that he had prepared during previous days, stones selected from specific locations along the creek bed, and personal belongings that had belonged to each family member. The children's responses to their father's activities demonstrated an awareness that transcended their normal understanding of household routines. Ruth had awakened without being summoned and had begun to dress herself in clothing that Isaac had laid out for her, though Margaret noted that her daughter's movements seemed mechanical and unnatural. Benjamin remained in his bed but showed signs of consciousness, his eyes following Isaac's preparations with an expression that suggested both terror and resignation. Little Mary continued to sleep, though her rest was disturbed by movements that indicated troubled dreams. Dr. Morse's examination of the creek during the early morning hours of October 2nd revealed conditions that seemed specifically designed to facilitate Isaac's intentions. The water level had risen despite the absence of recent rainfall, creating depths that would prove adequate for Isaac's purposes. More disturbing was the physician's observation that the creek's current had virtually ceased, leaving the water so still that it reflected the sky with mirror-like clarity. Isaac's approach to his family during the final hours demonstrated a combination of tenderness and inexorable purpose that Margaret found more terrifying than outright violence would have been. He attended to each child with careful attention to their comfort, ensuring that they were properly dressed and fed before beginning the journey to the creek. His manner suggested a father preparing his children for a significant but pleasant outing, though the materials he carried indicated far different intentions. The annotated Bible accompanied Isaac throughout his preparations, consulted at regular intervals as though he were following detailed instructions contained within its margins. Dr. Morse's later examination of the text revealed that Isaac had marked specific passages with symbols that corresponded to different phases of his planned activities. These markings demonstrated a level of organization that suggested months of careful planning, though the physician's investigation indicated that Isaac's specific intentions had crystallized only during his final weeks of biblical study. Margaret's attempts to intervene in Isaac's preparations met with responses that demonstrated his complete commitment to his chosen course of action. Her pleas for explanation were met with expressions of patient understanding, as though Isaac viewed her distress as a natural but temporary obstacle to the fulfillment of divine will. His manner toward her remained affectionate but distant, suggesting that he had already begun to view their relationship from the perspective of eternity rather than earthly attachment. The journey from the Cartwright house to the creek took place during the hour before dawn, when the landscape remained shrouded in darkness that seemed deeper than normal October conditions would suggest. Margaret's testimony describes an atmosphere of unnatural quiet that made their footsteps unnaturally prominent against the silence. The children followed their father without protest, though their compliance seemed to result from supernatural compulsion rather than ordinary obedience. Isaac's final preparations at the creek's edge demonstrated the same methodical approach that had characterized his biblical studies during the preceding months. He arranged the materials he had brought according to patterns that corresponded to diagrams contained in the Bible's margins, creating a configuration that served purposes visible only to himself. His movements showed no signs of haste or uncertainty, suggesting absolute confidence in the righteousness of his intended actions. The final chapter of the Cartwright tragedy unfolded in the grey hour before dawn on October 2nd, 1847, beside the creek that had claimed the attention of 3 generations of Cartwright men. Dr. Morse's reconstruction of events, compiled from Margaret's fragmented testimony and physical evidence discovered at the scene, presents a conclusion that defied both legal precedent and medical understanding. The physician's final report acknowledges the limitations of contemporary knowledge in explaining phenomena that seem to transcend ordinary categories of human behavior. Margaret Cartwright's account of the Creekside events remains incomplete, interrupted by periods of unconsciousness that she attributed to overwhelming shock. Her testimony describes Isaac's actions as proceeding with ritualistic precision, each movement corresponding to instructions that he appeared to be reading from the annotated Bible. The text remained open throughout the proceedings, its pages undisturbed by the morning breeze that had begun to stir the surrounding vegetation. The children's behavior during these final moments demonstrated responses that Margaret found impossible to reconcile with their normal personalities. Ruth had ceased all attempts at resistance or flight, standing quietly beside the creek with an expression that suggested acceptance of circumstances beyond her understanding. Benjamin's muteness had deepened to complete stillness, though his eyes remained alert and focused on his father's preparations. Little Mary had awakened fully, but showed no signs of fear or confusion, instead displaying a calm curiosity that seemed inappropriate to the gravity of the situation. Isaac's execution of his plan proceeded without the violence or struggle that might have been expected given the nature of his intentions. Dr. Morse's examination of the scene revealed evidence suggesting that the children had entered the creek voluntarily, though the physician acknowledged that this conclusion raised questions that medical science could not adequately address. The physical evidence indicated that Isaac had used the ropes and stones he had prepared, but in ways that suggested cooperation rather than coercion from his intended victims. The creek itself had undergone its final transformation during the hours of the tragedy, achieving conditions that seemed specifically designed to facilitate Isaac's purposes. The water had become perfectly transparent, allowing observers to see the bottom with unusual clarity, despite depths that should have obscured visibility. More disturbing was the complete absence of current, creating a stillness that transformed the waterway into what Margaret described as a mirror that reflected nothing. Margaret's rescue came through the intervention of neighbors who'd been awakened by sounds they could not identify, but found sufficiently disturbing to warrant investigation. Their arrival at the creek occurred approximately 1 hour after Isaac had begun his final preparations, though the timeline remained uncertain due to the disorienting effects that multiple witnesses attributed to the unnatural atmosphere surrounding the scene. The rescuers found Margaret unconscious on the creek bank, with no immediate sign of Isaac or the children. The search for Isaac and the children continued for 3 days, involving residents from throughout Warren County and extending along the creek for several miles downstream. Dr. Morse participated in these efforts, noting that the waterway had returned to its normal appearance and behavior within hours of the tragedy. The creek's depth and current showed no trace of the unusual conditions that had characterized it during the preceding weeks, though the physician's measurements confirmed that the water level remained higher than seasonal norms would suggest. The recovery of evidence from the creek bed provided the only physical confirmation of the night's events. Searchers discovered the annotated Bible resting on the bottom in water that should have been too deep to allow such precise placement. The book showed no signs of water damage despite its submersion, with its pages remaining perfectly legible and its binding intact. More disturbing was the discovery that Isaac's final annotations had been completed underwater, with fresh ink marking passages that seemed to provide commentary on the night's events. The bodies of Isaac and his children were never recovered, despite extensive searching that continued sporadically for months after the initial investigation. Dr. Morse noted that the creek's depth and current were insufficient to carry bodies beyond the search area, yet no trace of the missing family members was ever discovered. Local residents eventually concluded that the creek had somehow consumed them entirely, though this explanation satisfied neither legal authorities nor scientific inquiry. Margaret Cartwright survived the tragedy, but never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of witnessing events that challenged her understanding of reality. She spent her remaining years in the care of relatives in Nashville, dying in 1863 without ever providing a complete account of what she had observed beside the creek. The annotated Bible was sealed in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, where it remains to this day, its pages still bearing the accumulated insights of 3 generations of Cartwright men. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.